They say not all martyrs die with swords in their hands. Some die with secrets sealed behind their eyes. In 1989, a respected imam walked into a fire that should have killed him instantly, but witnesses swear he didn't flinch. They say he wasn't trying to escape, but to protect something buried, something that could unravel centuries of belief. He whispered something before the flames took him. Not a prayer, not a scream, just a name. And then he vanished. What triggered the riots that night wasn't just a clash of ideologies. It was what he found beneath the old foundation of that forgotten mosque. A locked box, a scroll, a map of faith no one was meant to see. They burned everything, hoping to silence it. But what if he wasn't silenced? What if he left behind the one thing even the cult couldn't destroy? The truth. Like this video, subscribe to Mystery Cults, and comment if you believe in forgotten truths. The town was barely a dot on the map. Southridge, Arizona. Dry, fading, and ignored by the world, just another desert town with broken windows and boarded-up churches. But there was one place no one touched, the old mosque on Hollow Bend. Locals said it was cursed, but not in the usual way. It didn't scream, it didn't bleed, it simply watched. Imam Numan arrived with calm eyes and a deeper purpose. He said he came to reconstruct what was fractured long before us, but no one understood what he meant. At least not until the first week of January, when the mosque's ground cracked open after decades of drought, revealing an entrance that wasn't in the original plans. The underground chamber wasn't made by modern hands. Carvings in languages no historian could translate ran across its dome. At the center was a box, charred around the edges as if it had already survived fire once. What Numan found inside was never officially documented, but those who got a glimpse spoke of aged pages, odd geometries, and symbols that pulsed like veins in candlelight. One of them even described it as a spiritual map of influence, detailing how major belief systems were orchestrated, not created, to control, to steer, and to silence the real connection between human memory and divine architecture. It wasn't long before strange things started happening. People began dreaming of places they'd never been. A child recited words no one had taught him. An elder vanished after claiming he saw the architect standing at his window. And then, the fire. Riots erupted across counties. The media blamed tension between factions. But what if that was just a convenient excuse? What if the unrest was a cover for something else? A purge of forbidden memory? The mosque burned that night. Most believed Numan died with it, but a few survivors insist they saw him standing in the flames, holding the box high above his head, untouched. His final words, captured on a melted cassette, were distorted but chilling. This was never about belief, it was about obedience. Imam Numan's disappearance should have closed the chapter, but it only deepened the mystery. In the days following the fire, Southridge wasn't just grieving, it was unraveling. What began as a communal silence slowly turned into collective disorientation. Street signs were found twisted into shapes resembling the same symbols from the underground chamber. Birds flew in perfect spirals over the mosque ruins every sunset for 7 nights straight. Dogs refused to cross the Hollow Bend intersection, and then came the whispers, not in the air, but in the walls. People reported hearing conversations happening behind bricks, voices speaking of the fractures in faith, and echoes that precede obedience. No one knew what it meant, but the fear was growing, silent and shared. One of the first people to break that silence was Officer Miguel Hart, the only responder who dared walk into the burning structure that night. In his final report before resigning, he wrote, "He didn't look afraid, he looked fulfilled, like someone who had released something ancient and personal into the world, and accepted the consequences." Miguel vanished 6 months later. His cruiser was found abandoned at the edge of the desert. His badge melted to the steering wheel, and the word "Remember" etched into the inside of the windshield, with fingernails. Then came the footage, leaked, blurry, but enough. A grainy recording from a broken security cam behind the mosque, time-stamped just minutes after the blaze began. It shows a shadow, tall, still, and cloaked, standing in front of the structure as the flames danced unnaturally around him, bending away instead of burning through. Behind him, flickers of movement, not people, not animals, but something else. Figures with elongated joints and heads bowed in unison. The recording was taken down within hours. Every mirror copy online flagged, deleted, but a few people had already downloaded it. And what they saw wasn't just impossible, it was predictive. In the video's final frame, carved into the soot-covered wall behind Numan's silhouette, are 5 words no one had painted, etched, or written. Yet they were there, clear as day. You were never meant to wake. The government dismissed the footage as digital manipulation. But the handwriting matched ancient burial markings found in Mesopotamian ruins, markings associated not with any known religion, but with a prehistoric group referred to in fringe texts as the Silence Keepers. These texts were banned by most theological institutions for containing corrupt timelines and unauthorized doctrines. But Numan had quoted from them in his final lectures, not wordful or word, but conceptually. "We do not choose what we believe," he once said. "We inherit what was designed for us to obey." That quote was later found written in ash on the walls of a hospital room belonging to a patient who had never spoken a word in 20 years. The deeper investigators tried to dig into Imam Numan's past, the more it blurred into myth. No known seminary listed his name, no academic record, no traceable relatives. Yet dozens of locals remembered him vividly, not just as a scholar, but as someone who seemed to already know the town before ever stepping into it. One woman, Miriam Greaves, swore she'd seen him in a photograph from her grandmother's attic. A sepia-toned image dated 1947. The problem? The man in the photo hadn't aged a day. He was standing near the same ruins the mosque was built upon, long before it existed, wearing the same ring Numan always wore, a silver band engraved with a symbol historians couldn't classify, a downward spiral intersected by a single vertical line. Theories spun fast. Some said he was a time traveler. Others claimed he was a defector from a forgotten sect, one that existed before organized religion took shape, a group that believed in decoding memory as a spiritual act. Not prayer, not worship. Memory. They called themselves the Continuance, according to a recovered page from a private journal found in Numan's abandoned rental home. The page described how certain individuals were chosen, not born, to act as keepers of historical emotion, trained to awaken truths that memory locks away for safety. The apartment he left behind was untouched by fire, but cold, unnaturally cold, even for the desert. Investigators found the walls covered in diagrams, spirals within spirals, veins mapped like cities, timelines branching in and out of points labeled only as echo thresholds. In one corner of the room stood an altar of sorts, not to any god, but to fragments of human lives, a broken child's shoe, a melted photograph, a bullet with a prayer scratched into its casing. It was as if Numan had built a temple not of worship, but of unresolved trauma, and behind the altar a single line painted in coal. Every faith was born from forgetting. Miriam, haunted by the photograph and her recurring dreams of a cathedral built underground, went public. She claimed Numan visited her in those dreams and spoke to her in riddles, always ending with the same sentence, "Ask them why history bleeds." Soon after her interview aired on a fringe podcast, she disappeared. Police found her phone buried under the Hollow Bend sign. Its last recorded voice memo was garbled, but some listeners swear they heard faint chanting, in reverse. The town, once merely silent, now seemed to hum, like an old machine waking up. Residents reported low-frequency vibrations at dawn, headaches and dreams that weren't their own. A teenage boy drew a map in his sleep that matched an ancient Middle Eastern site, one that had been sealed off by military forces for decades. Coincidence? Or was Numan's message leaking through, not as words but as memory, resurfacing across generations? More than memory was unraveling now. It was continuity itself. Patterns began to distort. A woman swore she saw her late husband sitting on the edge of their bed, humming a melody he used to play on their piano. the same one she'd sold 15 years ago. A schoolteacher collapsed mid-lecture after recognizing a symbol one of her students unconsciously drew. The same sigil that had once been branded into the shoulder of a prisoner during the Ottoman purges, according to a now-vanished museum archive. Southridge wasn't haunted in the traditional sense. It was overwritten, like reality was being palimpsested, each layer revealing an older one beneath it, as if someone, or something, was scraping the paint off time itself. And yet, through all of this, there were whispers of a second box. The one Newman opened was only half the story. According to fragments found in the scorched crawl space beneath the ruins, written in a mix of Phoenician, Aramaic, and something untranslatable, there was mention of a mirror vessel, one that did not hold memory, but reflected the forgetting, a counterpart object designed not to awaken but to seal. Rumor had it that this second relic had been taken by one of Newman's last disciples, a man who had vanished a decade ago, long before the Southridge Mosque even existed. He was known only by the name Marek. No surname, no birth record, a wanderer who was once seen preaching outside burned churches and abandoned asylums, always speaking in paradoxes. To forget is divine. Silence is the final scripture. Witnesses say he'd cry blood when reciting certain verses. No one had seen him in years, until he appeared in a grainy photograph posted to a conspiracy forum 2 weeks after the fire, standing just outside the police barricade at Southridge, his hand pressed to the fence, watching. The image was quickly removed, but not before it was downloaded and cross-referenced through biometric data. Shockingly, it matched an individual who had been legally declared dead in 1963, a war medic whose final report described finding an ancient artifact in a collapsed Syrian monastery. His notes, scribbled on the back of a bloodied ration card, read, "It sang when I touched it. I don't think I brought it back. I think it brought me." And now, those same words had been painted, in reversed Hebrew, across a tunnel wall near Hollow Bend Station. The tunnel had been sealed since 1979. Authorities blocked it off within an hour. The town was no longer just holding secrets. It was becoming one. What frightened people most wasn't the symbols or the sightings or even the changes in memory. It was the way truth itself had begun to bend. Longtime residents began remembering childhoods they never lived. A retired priest confessed live on a late-night radio show that he'd buried a relic beneath the church floorboards, even though that church hadn't existed during his tenure. When the floorboards were finally pulled up, there was something. A locket, sealed in amber, containing a strand of hair braided with thread older than carbon dating could verify. Attached was a note in Old Latin, translated roughly as, "He died to silence the path, do not remember him." But people were remembering, not because they wanted to, but because something in them was opening, slow, aching, inevitable. A mother woke to find her daughter scribbling a chant in charcoal on the living room wall. She didn't know the language, but later learned it matched funeral hymns from a civilization erased before the Iron Age. The child couldn't read or write, not yet. That same night, 9 clocks in 9 homes, none synchronized, all stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m. When restarted, they chimed a sequence of notes identical to the melody found in a cassette tape recovered from Newman's apartment. That melody, it traced back to an ancient funeral rite in a region once banned to archaeologists for psychological contamination. Fear wasn't the right word anymore. It was grief. For a history people never knew they'd lost, and for a version of themselves they were starting to remember too late. Whispers about Marek began circling again. Some believed he was searching for the second relic. Others believed he was the second relic. And in a heavily redacted file leaked by a former intelligence officer, a single sentence stood out, circled in red ink. Marek does not age because time avoids him. Perhaps Imam Numan hadn't opened the box to unleash something. Perhaps he opened it to buy time, and failed. If you were in his place, what would you have done? Let us know in the comments. By the 6th day after the fire, Southridge was no longer the same town. It looked the same, roads still cracked, the diner still lit by its flickering neon sign, the air still heavy with dust. But something beneath had shifted. Like time was breathing differently here now. Residents began reporting a recurring hallucination. They would see a room, stark, candlelit, with rusted metal walls, where a man stood with his back to them, whispering into a mirror. The mirror reflected nothing but shadow. Everyone who saw it described the same phrase etched into the wall. I am not the first version of myself. These weren't just dreams. People began waking up with sand in their palms, mud under their nails, or in one case, ash in their mouths. What had begun as memory bleed was now transforming into embodied forgetting. Individuals weren't just remembering different pasts, they were acting from them. A teacher who never learned Arabic recited a 9th century poem word for word. A man with no military background fell into a PTSD episode from a war that didn't exist. A boy, just 12, began drawing burial rites used only in prehistoric Anatolia. When questioned, he said, I remember being someone who buried my brother for breaking the circle. The ground still echoes. Authorities tried to explain it as a case of mass psychogenic illness, a psychological chain reaction triggered by collective trauma. But that didn't explain the physical anomalies, DNA mutations in blood samples, fingerprints changing shape, dental records reversing age. And it definitely didn't explain the circle of salt that kept appearing around Numan's gravesite. Even after multiple cleanings, even after surveillance was installed, the circle always reappeared, always just before dawn, always humming. At the center of this slow unraveling stood a truth no one wanted to name. The relic hadn't been meant to be found, and whatever Numan unlocked wasn't content to stay remembered. It wanted to be inhabited, possessed not as a ghost or spirit, but as a pattern. One that moved through language, grief, and time. One that used belief not as a shield, but as a doorway. A few began whispering about a hidden chapter, a second phase of the continuance doctrine that had been purposefully erased. Something called the forgetting rite. It was never meant to be used unless a memory became too dangerous to exist. Not for safety, for survival. And now the town had remembered too much. They say trauma leaves a mark. But what if the mark came first and trauma was just how the body caught up? That's what Dr. Evelyn Mora started to believe after she arrived in Southridge. A cultural anthropologist by training and a skeptic by nature, she had initially dismissed the rumors as collective hysteria, until she started forgetting her own name mid-sentence, until she found an old journal in her suitcase she swore she never owned. Its cover bore a symbol that matched the burned markings on Numan's desk. 2 interlocked spirals, one black, one pale gray, forming the shape of a closed eye. The entries inside weren't written in her handwriting, at least not the way she wrote now, but the style, the voice, it was hers, only older, sadder, written like someone who had already lived this moment 100 times before. I've failed again, one entry read. If I don't forget him this time, he remembers me, and then he wakes. That night, Evelyn sleepwalked for the first time in her life. Surveillance showed her walking barefoot into the woods behind the burned mosque. At exactly 2:44 a.m., she stopped at a clearing and began drawing a circle in the dirt. Not a pentagram, not runes, just one perfect silent circle. No entry, no exit. When asked about it the next day, she said only this: I wasn't making the circle, I was closing it. It was Evelyn who later discovered that the Southridge relic, the so-called mirror vessel, was not a standalone object. It was part of a pair, split apart during the fall of a forgotten sect of Sufi mystics. One vessel held memory, the other erased it. Together, they kept something dormant. Not a being, but an awareness, a design. And with Numan gone, only the eraser remained hidden. This explained why memories were bleeding. Without the counterweight, the remembering was no longer balanced by forgetting, and the human mind was never built to hold that kind of unfiltered past. A past where belief was a living force, and thoughts could rewrite flesh. A past where Marek might have been the first to look too deep, and was now no longer just a man. People began questioning if Marek had ever been born at all, or if he was simply what happened when too many people remembered the same lie too clearly, for too long. Evelyn found one final note in her alleged journal. The past doesn't come back. It catches up. And now it was sprinting through Southridge. It began with a sound, a low thrum, barely audible, like the earth humming through bone. Evelyn heard it every night now, usually around 3:17 a.m., always beneath her feet. Not in the walls. Beneath. The vibration came with visions. Brief, fragmented, yet recurring. A hand pressing against stone. A child's voice reciting names backward. And a door. Not one built by human hands, but formed of ash and memory. Something that looked like stone until you stared too long and realized it was still breathing. Evelyn became obsessed with the coordinates scrawled in the back of the journal, a string of numbers that led her deep into the state archives. There, in a box labeled Unfiled Anomalies, she found a map, hand-drawn, yellowed, with a large red X marked over an area just outside Southridge. It had no roads, no structures, just a name handwritten beside the X, where Marek was buried the first time. First time? She took it to the town historian, a man in his 90s who hadn't spoken in years due to a stroke. When he saw the map, he wept. Then, for the first time in over a decade, he muttered, "Don't dig. He waits where forgetting dies." But Evelyn had already decided. With 2 local volunteers and a camera crew, she made her way to the location. Dense forest, silent as if the trees themselves were holding breath. They found nothing at first. Then, near a ring of 7 collapsed stones, her equipment began glitching, batteries drained, audio scrambled, and when she touched one of the stones, she felt warmth, not heat, but pulse. She dug. A foot beneath the surface, they uncovered bones, but not human. The skeletal form was long, distorted, fused, ribs spiraling inward, a skull with no eye sockets but layered ridges like echo chambers. Near it was a shard of obsidian etched with one word, return. That night Evelyn dreamt of Marek, not as a man, but as a pattern. He stood in a hallway of mirrors that all showed different versions of her. In one, she was the one who gave him the box. In another, she was the child who watched him open it. In a third, she was him. He whispered, "We do not awaken alone." She awoke with blood on her palms. No wounds, no cuts, just memory she didn't ask for, and could no longer forget. In the days that followed, Evelyn stopped recognizing the sound of her own voice. Recordings of her interviews began to warp, not with static, but with layered versions of herself speaking in slightly different words, different accents. It was as if multiple Evelyns were bleeding into the same timeline, each remembering events just a shade apart. One tape captured her saying, "The cult must be stopped." Another, "We were never the cult. We were the containment." Every night her dreams took her deeper into that hallway of mirrors. Sometimes she was running, sometimes hiding. Once she saw a mirror with no reflection at all, just whispers behind the glass. She tried to listen, but her ears filled with dust, and when she awoke, there was soil in her bedsheets. Her assistant Jonah, a documentary intern from Boston, began noticing subtle changes in her. A new scar on her collarbone she couldn't explain, moments where she would pause mid-sentence and seem to wait, like someone else was supposed to answer. Once during an interview about the town's fire history, Evelyn casually mentioned a fire that burned Southridge in 1843, but no such record existed. When pressed, she insisted she'd read about it in the archives. The town library had no such book. Later that week, Jonah found her in the old mosque ruins, whispering to a crack in the wall. She didn't remember going there, but her notepad held pages of text, written backwards. When deciphered, it was a prayer, not from any known religion, a chant to something named the Archive Without Order. And then came the fog. One morning, the entire town awoke to find Southridge blanketed in a thick gray mist, one that refused to burn off even by midday. It muffled sound, distorted space. People began seeing others where they shouldn't be. A grandmother already buried seen shopping at the corner store. A child laughing who had no mouth. Marek was now being spotted by multiple people, at once, in different places, wearing different clothes. Jonah finally confronted Evelyn. "What did you bring here?" She looked at him confused, then smiled. But it wasn't her smile. It was older, sadder, and the voice that came out wasn't hers either. "He was always here. I just remembered too clearly." The fog didn't lift. Not the next day, not the one after. Southridge began to lose time, literally. Phone clocks desynced, watches stopped or spun erratically. People slept for hours and awoke minutes later. Others swore entire conversations had never happened, while some claimed they heard them twice. Evelyn kept filming everything, desperate to document the town's slow unraveling. But none of the footage would play back. The screen always showed static, until one night, for 5 seconds, the static cleared. The footage showed Evelyn staring into the lens. No camera in her hands, no fog outside. Just her, whispering, "You have to forget me, or he'll use me again." Jonah tried to confront her again, but she was slipping, not just mentally but spatially. He would find her in the kitchen and seconds later hear her voice from the attic. Her presence became erratic, echo-like, and then came the scream, not hers, but everyone's. Across Southridge in the same moment, people clutched their heads as a high-pitched shriek erupted inside their skulls. It wasn't sound. It was a memory, forced back. Those who heard it began to recall things they never lived, entire lives, different names. Some collapsed. Others ran into the woods never to return. One man trembling muttered, "I was the one who buried him last time. I remember the weight." The town psychiatrist took his own life that night, leaving a note. "There is no madness, only memory too ancient for the mind." Evelyn disappeared the following morning. Jonah found her journal. Its last page was dated 3 days in the future. It read, "He is no longer bound to one version of time. He's learned to skip, to borrow, to echo, and every time we remember him, we pull him closer." In the distance, the sound of humming stones began again. If this story shocked you, like, subscribe and share. Hit the bell icon for the next part. Part 2 teaser. But what he saw next was never meant for human eyes. The fog was only a curtain. Behind it stood something older than belief, something that remembered us. And beneath the town, it was still moving. Part 2 will uncover what even the cult feared. Comment Part 2 if you're ready.